The morning sun had barely risen over the jagged peaks of Helmand province when the first shot echoed across the valley. It was June 2009, and the temperature was already climbing toward unbearable. In a mud-walled compound on the outskirts of Sangin, a group of Taliban fighters had gathered to plan their next ambush against a British patrol that had been operating in the area for 3 days. They never heard the bullet that killed their commander. One moment, Mullah Rashid was speaking, his finger tracing a route on a hand-drawn map spread across a worn wooden table. The next moment, he was falling, a small hole in his temple, his eyes still open, still looking at the map as if death had been nothing more than an interruption. The men around him froze. There had been no warning, no sound of a helicopter, no distant rumble of a drone, no explosion. Just silence, and then death. From a concealed position nearly 1 kilometer away, Corporal James Hartley of the 1st Battalion, the Rifles, exhaled slowly and worked the bolt of his L115A3 rifle. Through his Schmidt and Bender scope, he watched the chaos unfold in the compound. Men were scrambling, shouting, looking to the sky for the threat they assumed must be there. They never thought to look at the distant ridge where Hartley lay motionless, his ghillie suit blending perfectly with the sun-bleached rocks and sparse vegetation. His spotter, Lance Corporal David Morrison, whispered beside him, "Confirmed kill. They're scattering." Hartley said nothing. He was already scanning for another target, his breathing controlled, his heart rate deliberately slowed. This was his 7th deployment, his 3rd to Afghanistan, and he had learned long ago that emotion was the enemy of precision. In this moment, he was not a man. He was a mechanism, a tool of war as cold and efficient as the rifle in his hands. In the compound below, the remaining fighters had taken cover. They knew now that they were being hunted, but they did not know from where. One of them, a young man named Farid, who had joined the Taliban only 6 months earlier, pressed his back against a wall and tried to control his breathing. His hands were shaking. He had been in firefights before. He had faced British soldiers in close combat. He had even survived a drone strike that had killed 3 of his companions. But this was different. This was something he could not fight, could not see, could not understand. "Where is he?" someone shouted. "Where is the sniper?" No one answered. No one knew. Hartley watched them through his scope. He could see their fear, could read it in the way they moved, in the way they pressed themselves against walls and refused to cross open ground. He had seen this reaction before, in Iraq, in other parts of Afghanistan. It was always the same. Men who would charge into gunfire, who would strap explosives to their bodies and walk towards certain death, became paralyzed when faced with the invisible threat of a sniper. It was not the death they feared, it was the not knowing, the uncertainty, the feeling of being watched by eyes they could never find. Morrison spoke again. Movement on the left, 2 men trying to reach the vehicle. Hartley shifted his rifle slightly, acquiring the new targets. 2 fighters were making a run for a battered Toyota pickup truck parked in the compound's courtyard. If they reached it, they would escape. They would live to fight another day, to plant another IED, to kill another British soldier. He tracked their movement, calculating distance, wind speed, the slight upward angle of the shot. His finger tightened on the trigger. The first man fell 3 meters from the truck, the bullet catching him in the chest. The second man stopped, looked at his fallen companion, and then made a decision that would haunt Farid for the rest of his life. Instead of running, instead of taking cover, he simply stood there. He raised his hands to the sky and screamed something that Hartley could not hear. Then he sat down in the dirt and waited. Hartley did not shoot him. There was no need. The man was no longer a threat. He was broken. From his position on the ridge, Hartley continued to watch the compound for another hour. No one else moved. No one tried to escape. They simply waited, trapped by their own fear, prisoners of an enemy they could not see. When he finally withdrew, Crawling backward through the rocks until he was certain he could not be observed, Hartley allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had killed 2 men today. He had neutralized a Taliban leadership cell and prevented what intelligence suggested would have been a major ambush. By any measure, the mission was a success. But as he made his way back to the forward operating base, he could not shake the image of that man sitting in the dirt, hands raised to an empty sky, waiting for a death that never came. In that moment, Hartley understood something that would take years to fully articulate. The true weapon of a sniper was not the bullet. It was the fear, the knowledge that death could come at any moment from any direction without warning or explanation. It was a weapon that left no marks on the body but carved deep wounds in the mind. Miles away, in an operations center in Camp Bastion, British military commanders were reviewing the morning's action. The drone footage showed the aftermath clearly. 2 dead, 1 compound neutralized, enemy movement in the area reduced to 0. On paper, it was a textbook operation. But the men in that room knew something that the statistics could never capture. They knew that the real impact of what Corporal Hartley had done that morning would not be measured in body counts or territory gained. It would be measured in the stories that would spread through the Taliban ranks in the coming days. Stories of the invisible death, stories of men killed by a ghost they could never find. And in the mountains and valleys of Helmand province, those stories would grow. They would be whispered in safe houses and shouted in training camps. They would become legends, warnings, prophecies of doom for any fighter who dared to operate in the open. The British had many weapons in Afghanistan. They had helicopters and armored vehicles. They had bombs that could level buildings and missiles that could strike from the sky. But none of these weapons would be spoken of with the same fear, the same hatred as the snipers, because the snipers were different. The snipers were personal. Years later, when the war was winding down and historians were beginning to write their accounts of the conflict, an Afghan man named Farid would give an interview to a Western journalist. He was older now, his beard streaked with grey, his eyes carrying the weight of everything he had seen and done. When asked about his time fighting the British, he said something that the journalist would never forget. "We did not fear the drones," Farid said, his voice quiet but steady. "The drones were machines. They killed from the sky, yes, but they were impersonal, like weather, like a storm. You could not hate a storm. You could only wait for it to pass." He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something far away. But the snipers were different. The snipers we hated. Because they were men, like us, but they killed like ghosts. You never knew when they were watching. You never knew when you were already dead. That fear, it never left you. Even now, sometimes I dream of crosshairs, and I wake up reaching for my chest, checking for the hole I know should be there. The journalist asked him to elaborate, to explain why the snipers had such a profound psychological impact compared to the drones and airstrikes that killed far more fighters. Farid thought for a long moment before answering. Because with a drone, you die with your brothers. You die together. There is a kind of comfort in that. You are not alone. He shook his head slowly. But a sniper chooses you. He watches you. He decides that you, specifically, will die. And when that bullet comes, you are completely alone. Your brothers cannot help you. Your faith cannot help you. You are just chosen. And then you are gone. He fell silent after that, and the journalist did not press further. But those words would stay with her. And when she wrote her article about the war in Afghanistan, she would use Farid's quote as her opening line. It would become one of the most read pieces about the conflict, not because it revealed new information about strategy or politics, but because it captured something essential about the nature of modern warfare. The technology had changed, the weapons had evolved, but the most terrifying thing on the battlefield was still a human being with a rifle and the patience to wait. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every story reveals truths about human nature that change how you see the world. Subscribe now so you never miss a single revelation. To understand why British snipers became the most feared element of coalition forces in Afghanistan, one must first understand where they came from and how they were made. The tradition of British military marksmanship stretches back centuries, but the modern sniper program traces its roots to the trenches of World War I, where German sharpshooters terrorized Allied positions with devastating effectiveness. The British response was to create their own corps of specialized marksmen, trained not just to shoot, but to think, to observe, to survive in the no-man's land between the lines. That tradition evolved through World War II, through the jungles of Malaya and the streets of Northern Ireland, through the Falklands and the deserts of Iraq. By the time British forces deployed to Afghanistan in significant numbers in 2006, the sniper program had been refined into something approaching an art form. The selection process alone was brutal. Candidates were drawn from the ranks of experienced infantrymen, men who had already proven themselves in combat. But combat experience was only the beginning. The snipers needed something more. Patience that bordered on the inhuman, emotional control that could seem almost sociopathic, and an ability to remain completely still for hours, sometimes days, in conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. Sergeant Major Thomas Reed had been through the selection process in 2003, and he still remembered it with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The first week, they don't teach you anything about shooting, he would later tell a documentary crew. They test your mind, they deprive you of sleep, they put you in impossible situations and watch how you react. They want to know if you can think when everything inside you is screaming to move, to act, to do something. Because that's what sniping is, really. It's the discipline to do nothing until the exact right moment. Reed had been one of 12 candidates in his class. 3 made it through. The training that followed was comprehensive and merciless. Marksmanship, obviously, hours upon hours on the range, learning to read wind and distance, learning to compensate for temperature and humidity, learning to make shots that seemed impossible to civilian observers. But marksmanship was almost the easy part. The harder skills were the invisible ones: camouflage and concealment, stalking, the ability to move through terrain without leaving any sign of passage, the ability to construct a hide position that could survive scrutiny from mere meters away, the ability to observe, to gather intelligence, to understand enemy patterns and predict enemy behavior, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to wait. People think snipers are about shooting, Reed explained. But shooting is maybe 5% of what we do. 95% is watching, waiting, understanding. A sniper might spend 3 days in position before taking a single shot. 3 days without moving, without speaking, without doing anything except watching and learning. This was the training that produced the men who would deploy to Helmand Province in the summer of 2009. They were part of the British surge into southern Afghanistan, an effort to stabilize a region that had become the heartland of the Taliban insurgency. The mission was clear: disrupt enemy operations, protect the local population, and create space for the Afghan government to establish control. The reality on the ground was far more complex. Helmand Province was a landscape of contradictions: fertile river valleys where farmers grew poppy alongside legitimate crops, ancient towns where tribal loyalties ran deeper than any national identity, mountain passes that had swallowed armies for centuries, and threading through it all, the enemy, not a conventional force that could be identified and destroyed, but an insurgency that melted into the population, that struck without warning and vanished without trace. The conventional forces struggled with this enemy. Patrols could clear a village in the morning, only to face an ambush from the same village in the afternoon. IEDs claimed lives on roads that had been swept clean just hours before. The enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, an invisible presence that could not be pinned down. But the snipers operated differently. They did not patrol, they did not clear, they observed, they waited. And when they acted with a precision that the insurgents had never encountered before. Captain Michael Brennan commanded a sniper platoon during the 2009 deployment. Years later, he would write a book about his experiences, and in it, he tried to explain the unique role that his men played in the conflict. "Conventional forces operate in the open," he wrote. "They move through the terrain, they engage the enemy, they take ground. It's a visible, physical presence. The enemy knows where they are and can plan accordingly. Snipers are the opposite. We operate in the shadows. We see without being seen. We know without being known, and that creates a different kind of pressure on the enemy, a psychological pressure that conventional operations cannot replicate." Brennan described a mission early in the deployment that illustrated this principle. Intelligence had identified a Taliban commander who was organizing attacks on coalition forces from a compound near the town of Musa Kala. The commander was careful. He never stayed in one place for long, never used electronic communications that could be tracked, never appeared in public where he might be targeted by drones or airstrikes. But he had a weakness. Every Friday, he attended prayers at a small mosque near the compound. The mosque itself was off limits. Coalition rules of engagement strictly prohibited targeting religious sites. But the path between the compound and the mosque was not. Brennan's team spent 4 days preparing for the mission. They studied satellite imagery and drone footage. They interviewed locals who had been evacuated from the area. They mapped every possible approach route, every potential hide position, every line of sight. They calculated distances, wind patterns, the angle of the sun at the time the commander was likely to appear. When the day came, 2 snipers were in position before dawn. They had crawled nearly 2 kilometers through irrigation ditches and poppy fields to reach a hide position on a low ridge overlooking the compound. They wore ghillie suits covered in local vegetation. They had not eaten solid food in 24 hours to avoid any need that might force them to move. The commander emerged at precisely the time the intelligence had predicted. He walked slowly, flanked by 2 bodyguards, talking on what appeared to be a satellite phone, a violation of his own security protocols that suggested either arrogance or an emergency. The first shot killed him instantly. The second shot, fired a fraction of a second later by the second sniper, killed one of the bodyguards. The third bodyguard threw himself to the ground and began screaming for help. The snipers did not fire again. Their mission was complete. They remained in position for another 3 hours, watching, recording, gathering intelligence on the response to the killing. Then they withdrew, as invisibly as they had arrived. The commander's death sent shockwaves through the Taliban network in the region, but it was not the death itself that had the greatest impact. It was the manner of the death. No drone had circled overhead. No helicopter had approached. No patrol had moved through the area. The commander had simply walked out of his compound and died. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken. Nowhere was safe. No precaution was sufficient. The British could reach out and touch anyone, anywhere, at any time. In the weeks that followed, intelligence reported a significant change in enemy behavior. Commanders became reluctant to move in the open. Meetings were held underground, in caves, in windowless rooms. Fighters who had once walked freely through villages now traveled only at night or not at all. The snipers had not defeated the Taliban. That was never their purpose, but they had introduced a new variable into the enemy's calculations, a constant presence of fear that made every decision more difficult, every movement more dangerous. "We used to say that a sniper's most important kill was the one he never took," Captain Brennan wrote. Because the threat of that kill, the possibility of it, changed everything. It made the enemy hesitate, it made them doubt, it made them afraid. And fear in an insurgency is worth more than 100 bullets. This was the force that deployed to Helmand Province in 2009. Men trained to the peak of their profession, equipped with the finest weapons their nation could provide, and imbued with a tradition of excellence that stretched back a century. They were few in number, never more than a few dozen at any given time, but their impact would be felt across the entire province, and the enemy would learn to hate them. The Sangin Valley had a reputation among British forces. They called it the most dangerous square mile on earth, and the statistics supported the claim. More British soldiers died in Sangin than in any other location in Afghanistan. The narrow valley, with its thick vegetation and maze of irrigation channels, was perfect terrain for ambushes. The local population was deeply intertwined with the insurgency, and the enemy fought with a ferocity that seemed almost suicidal. It was into this environment that Corporal James Hartley and his team deployed in July 2009. Hartley was 32 years old, a veteran of multiple deployments, a man who had seen enough combat to fill several lifetimes. But even he felt a chill when he first looked down into the Sangin Valley from the helicopter bringing him to Forward Operating Base Jackson. The base was small, barely more than a cluster of fortified buildings surrounded by HESCO barriers and razor wire. It housed a company of infantry and a handful of support elements. The snipers were there to provide overwatch, to protect patrols, to gather intelligence. But everyone knew their real purpose was to change the psychological dynamic of the fight. The enemy in Sangin was different from other parts of Helmand. These were not foreign fighters or ideological zealots. These were local men, men who knew every irrigation ditch, every poppy field, every hiding place in the valley. They had been fighting for years, first against the Soviets, then against each other, now against the coalition. War was not an interruption of their lives. War was their lives. And they were very, very good at it. Hartley's first mission was a 3-day observation post overlooking a crossroads that intelligence had identified as a meeting point for insurgent leaders. He and his spotter Morrison occupied a hide position in the ruins of a bombed-out compound on a hillside above the crossroads. The position offered excellent sightlines, but limited concealment. If the enemy found them, extraction would be nearly impossible. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. Hartley watched farmers move through the fields below. He watched children play in the dusty streets of a nearby village. He watched life continue in a way that seemed almost normal, almost peaceful. On the 3rd day, the enemy came. They arrived just after dawn, 4 men on motorcycles, moving fast along the road toward the crossroads. Hartley tracked them through his scope, noting their weapons, their clothing, their body language. These were not farmers. These were fighters. The motorcycles stopped at the crossroads, and the men dismounted. They spoke briefly, then split up, 2 moving toward a compound to the east, 2 heading for the village. Hartley made a decision. He keyed his radio and reported the contact to base. The response was immediate. Cleared to engage. He chose his target carefully. The man moving toward the compound was older than the others, his beard streaked with grey, his movements deliberate and confident. He carried himself like a leader. The shot was clean, the man fell without a sound, and for a moment nothing happened. The other fighters did not realize what had occurred. They kept walking, unaware that their world had changed. Then someone screamed. What followed was chaos. The remaining fighters scattered, seeking cover, firing wildly into the hills in all directions. They had no idea where the shot had come from. They had no idea how many enemies they faced. All they knew was that death had found them in a place they had considered safe. Hartley did not fire again. His position was good, but not good enough to survive a sustained firefight. He and Morrison began their withdrawal, crawling backward through the ruins, using every scrap of cover the terrain provided. They made it back to base 6 hours later, exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. The intelligence they brought with them, photographs, observations, detailed maps of enemy movements, would prove invaluable in the weeks ahead. But the real impact of the mission was something that could not be measured in intelligence reports. Word spread quickly through the valley. A Taliban commander had been killed at the crossroads. No one knew how, no one knew by whom. The British had struck from nowhere and vanished into nowhere, leaving only a body and a mystery. In the days that followed, enemy activity near the crossroads dropped to almost nothing. Fighters who had once gathered openly now moved only under cover of darkness. Meetings that had once been held in compounds were now held in caves, in tunnels, in places where the sky could not see. The fear had begun to spread. Hartley would spend 3 months in the Afghan Valley. In that time, he would participate in dozens of missions, some ending in shots fired, others in nothing more than observation and intelligence gathering. He would see friends wounded and killed. He would feel the constant pressure of operating in an environment where every step could trigger an IED, every corner could hide an ambush. But through it all, he would maintain the discipline that his training had instilled, the patience, the control, the ability to separate the man from the mission, to become the mechanism that his role required. Years later, when asked about that deployment, Hartley would speak with characteristic understatement. "Sangin was difficult," he said. "The enemy was skilled. The terrain was challenging. Every mission felt like it could be your last." He paused, considering his words. "But we had a job to do. We did it. That's all there is to say, really." What he did not say, what he could not say, was how that job had changed him, how the weight of those months pressed down on him in ways he was only beginning to understand, how the faces of the men he had killed visited him in dreams, not as accusations, but as questions. Questions he could not answer. The war in Afghanistan would continue for many more years. The snipers would remain a constant presence, feared and hated by the enemy, respected and relied upon by their own forces. But for James Hartley, the deployment to Sangin would mark a turning point, the moment when the abstract calculus of war became something personal, something that could not be left behind when the deployment ended. He was not alone in this. Across the British military, snipers were grappling with the psychological burden of their work. They had been trained to kill with precision and distance, to view their targets through the dehumanizing lens of a scope. But they were still human, and the human cost of their actions was something that no training could fully prepare them for. In a compound somewhere in the Sangin Valley, a young Afghan fighter named Farid was also grappling with the aftermath of that day at the crossroads. He had not been present when the commander was killed, but he had heard the stories. He had seen the fear in the eyes of men who had once seemed fearless. And he had begun to understand something that would shape the rest of his life. There were some enemies that could not be fought, only endured. If this story is touching your heart, pause for a moment and leave a comment saying, "Fear has no distance." Your words connect us, and together we honor these untold stories. The psychological impact of snipers on the Taliban insurgency was not a matter of speculation. It was documented, analyzed, and exploited by coalition military planners throughout the conflict. Captured fighters spoke openly about their fear of the British marksmen. Intelligence reports detailed changes in enemy behavior that could only be attributed to the sniper threat. Taliban commanders issued directives warning their fighters to avoid open ground, to travel only at night, to never gather in groups of more than 3. The fear was so pervasive that it began to affect recruitment. Young men who might have joined the insurgency hesitated when they heard stories of the invisible death that waited on distant ridgelines. Families who had supported the Taliban began to question whether the cause was worth the risk of having their sons picked off one by an enemy they could never see. But to understand why the snipers were feared more than the drones, why they generated a hatred that the technological weapons did not, required understanding something deeper about the psychology of combat. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a military psychologist who studied the effects of different weapons systems on enemy morale during the Afghanistan conflict. Her research, conducted primarily through interviews with captured fighters and defectors, revealed patterns that challenged conventional thinking about modern warfare. When we talked to these men about drones, we found fear, certainly, Dr. Mitchell explained in a lecture at the Royal United Services Institute, but it was a diffuse fear, almost abstract. They described the drones as a force of nature, something that killed indiscriminately, something that could not be reasoned with or understood. They accepted drone strikes the way one accepts a flood or an earthquake. Terrible, yes, but impersonal. She paused, adjusting her notes. The snipers were different. When we asked about snipers, the fear became personal, visceral. These men spoke of being hunted, of being watched, of being chosen. They described a feeling of vulnerability that went far beyond the physical threat. One man told me that after his unit lost several fighters to sniper fire, he could not sleep for weeks. He would lie awake at night, convinced that a British marksman was watching him through a scope, waiting for the moment when he would close his eyes. The difference, Dr. Mitchell argued, came down to agency. A drone was a machine controlled by someone thousands of miles away, guided by algorithms and cameras. There was no human connection between the drone operator and the target. The killing was almost bureaucratic in its detachment. But a sniper was different. A sniper was a man who had chosen to lie in wait for hours, sometimes days, studying his target, learning his patterns, waiting for the perfect moment. When the bullet came, it came from a human decision, a human choice, a human judgment that this particular life should end at this particular moment. That human element transformed the fear into something more potent: hatred. The men we interviewed did not hate drone operators, Dr. Mitchell observed. They barely thought of them as people, but they hated snipers with an intensity that surprised even experienced interrogators. They wanted to find these men, to capture them, to make them suffer. The sniper had become personal, and personal threats generate personal responses. This dynamic played out in ways that shaped the battlefield. When coalition forces captured a drone operator or technician, the reaction from the Taliban was relatively muted. The prisoner was valuable for intelligence purposes, but generated little emotional response. When a sniper was captured, or when the Taliban believed they had captured a sniper, the reaction was very different. Several incidents during the war illustrated this pattern. In 2008, a British soldier was captured by insurgents in Helmand province. Intelligence indicated that he was not a sniper, merely a rifleman separated from his unit during an ambush. But the Taliban believed he was a marksman, and they treated him accordingly. He was not seen again. The hatred extended beyond the battlefield. In Taliban propaganda videos, snipers were singled out for particular condemnation. Preachers in Taliban-controlled areas described the British marksman in terms usually reserved for enemies of the faith. The sniper had become a symbol, a focal point for the rage and frustration that the insurgency felt toward an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. But if the Taliban hated the snipers, they also learned from them. As the war progressed, the insurgency developed its own corps of sharpshooters, men trained to counter the British threat with precision fire of their own. These fighters were never as skilled as their British counterparts, but they did not need to be. Their purpose was psychological as much as tactical, to demonstrate that the coalition did not have a monopoly on invisible death. The result was an escalation of fear on both sides. British patrols learned to dread the crack of a distant rifle as much as the explosion of an IED. Snipers who had once operated with near impunity found themselves being hunted even as they hunted others. Corporal Hartley experienced this evolution firsthand during his deployment to Sangin. In the early weeks, his team could operate with relative freedom, moving through the terrain with confidence in their concealment skills. By the end of the deployment, every mission felt like a duel, a contest between invisible opponents who could only see each other through scopes and guesswork. It changed the way we worked, Hartley recalled. In the beginning, we were the predators. By the end, we were as much prey as predator. You never knew if you were watching them or they were watching you. You never knew if the position you had chosen was safe or if you were already in someone's crosshairs. The psychological burden of this uncertainty was immense. Snipers returned from deployments with rates of post-traumatic stress disorder significantly higher than other combat troops. They suffered from nightmares, from hypervigilance, from an inability to feel safe even in the most secure environments. But perhaps the heaviest burden was one that few snipers spoke about openly: the intimacy of their kills. An infantryman in a firefight experiences killing as chaos. There are bullets flying in all directions, explosions, smoke, confusion. The enemy is a shape, a movement, a threat to be neutralized. There is rarely time for thought, for consideration, for the kind of deliberate decision-making that defines moral responsibility. A sniper experiences something very different. Through his scope, the target becomes a person. The sniper sees the target's face, his clothing, his gestures. He watches the target interact with others, hears him laugh, sees him prey. And then, after hours or days of observation, the sniper makes a conscious, deliberate decision to end that person's life. That level of intimacy created a psychological dynamic that was unique in modern warfare. Some snipers developed a kind of professional detachment, viewing their work as a technical challenge rather than a moral one. Others struggled with the weight of what they had done, haunted by faces that refused to fade from memory. Hartley fell somewhere between these extremes. He understood intellectually that his work was necessary. The men he killed were combatants who had chosen to take up arms against his country and his comrades. They would have killed him without hesitation if given the chance. But understanding did not always bring peace. In quiet moments, when the adrenaline faded and the mission was complete, he found himself thinking about the lives he had ended, about the families who would never know what happened to their sons and brothers, about the futures that had been erased by his trigger finger. He did not speak of these thoughts. In the culture of the British military, such doubts were signs of weakness, vulnerabilities that could compromise effectiveness. Snipers were expected to be above emotion, above doubt, above the human frailties that affected ordinary soldiers. But they were not above these things. They were human, and the cost of their humanity was something they carried long after the deployments ended. By 2012, the British presence in Helmand province had begun to wind down. The surge that had brought thousands of troops to the region was ending, and the long process of withdrawal had begun. Forward operating bases that had been built at tremendous cost were dismantled or handed over to Afghan forces. Patrols that had once pushed deep into contested territory were scaled back to defensive positions. The snipers remained active until the very end. Their skills were too valuable, their psychological impact too significant to be withdrawn early. But even they could sense that the war was entering a new phase, one defined not by victory or defeat, but by something more ambiguous. Corporal Hartley, now Sergeant Hartley, deployed to Helmand for the last time in the spring of 2012. It was his 5th deployment to Afghanistan, and he could feel the difference immediately. The enemy was still there, still dangerous, still capable of inflicting casualties, but there was a weariness in the air, a sense that both sides knew the end was coming. His final mission was unremarkable in many ways. He and his team spent 4 days observing a suspected Taliban safe house on the outskirts of Lashkar-Gah. They watched fighters come and go, documented their movements, reported their findings to headquarters. On the 4th day, they received orders to engage. A senior commander was present, intelligence confirmed, and the opportunity was too valuable to pass up. Hartley set up his position with the same care he had exercised hundreds of times before. He calculated the distance, assessed the wind, controlled his breathing. Through his scope, he watched the compound, waiting for the target to appear. When the commander emerged, Hartley took a moment to study him. An older man, perhaps 50, with a grey beard and a slight limp. He carried himself with authority, speaking to the younger fighters around him with gestures that suggested experience and confidence. Hartley thought for a moment about what that man's life might have been like. He had probably fought the Soviets as a young man, had probably seen more war than anyone should ever see. He had probably made choices that seemed right at the time, choices that led him to this compound, to this moment, to the crosshairs of a British rifle. Then Hartley pushed those thoughts away. They had no place in this moment. They would only make the job harder. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet crossed the distance in less than a second. The commander fell without a sound, his body crumpling in a way that Hartley had seen too many times before. The fighters around him scattered, their shouts barely audible from Hartley's position. He did not feel satisfaction. He did not feel guilt. He felt only the cold emptiness that had become his constant companion, the numbness that allowed him to do what had to be done. The withdrawal took 6 hours. By the time Hartley reached base, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that seemed almost beautiful. He stood for a moment, watching the sunset, allowing himself a rare moment of stillness. An officer approached him with news. The commander he had killed was a significant target, responsible for dozens of attacks on coalition and Afghan forces. His death would disrupt Taliban operations in the region for months. Hartley nodded. "Good," he said. And then he walked away. He did not know it then, but that was his last kill. Budget cuts and strategic shifts would reduce the British sniper presence in Afghanistan, and Hartley's deployment ended without another shot fired. He returned to England, to a country that had largely forgotten the war, to a society that did not know how to welcome home the men who had fought it. The transition was difficult. Hartley had spent most of his adult life in the military, and civilian life felt alien, almost surreal. The skills that had made him valuable in combat were useless in peacetime. The discipline that had allowed him to function in war made it difficult to relax in safety. He struggled with sleep, with crowds, with the constant feeling of being watched that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, but now served only to exhaust him. He went through the mandatory psychological evaluations, told the doctors what they needed to hear, and was discharged with a clean bill of mental health that he knew was a lie. The years that followed were a slow process of adjustment. He married a woman who understood, somehow, the silences that he could not fill with words. He took a job that used his skills in a civilian context, training security personnel and advising on threat assessment. He learned, gradually, to sleep through the night without reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. But the memories did not fade. The faces of the men he had killed remained vivid, visiting him in quiet moments with a persistence that no amount of time could diminish. He did not regret what he had done. He still believed that his work had been necessary, that the lives he had taken were the price of the lives he had saved. But belief and peace were not the same thing, and peace remained elusive. Thousands of miles away, in a village in Helmand province, Farid was also adjusting to peace. The war had ended, or at least the phase of it that involved British troops. The Taliban had not been defeated, but they had been changed. scattered, weakened, forced to adapt to a world where their enemies could reach out and touch them from distances they could not comprehend. Farid had survived. He had left the fighting years before the end, disillusioned by the endless cycle of violence and death. He had married, had children, had tried to build something that looked like a normal life. But the memories did not leave him either. The fear he had felt during those years, the constant awareness of being watched, of being hunted, had become part of who he was. He still avoided open ground when possible. He still flinched at distant sounds that might be gunshots. But in their separate lives, in their separate struggles, they were connected by something stronger than the forces that had made them enemies. They were connected by their humanity, by the fear and the courage, the hatred and the forgiveness, the pain and the hope that defined them both. And perhaps in some small way their stories could bridge the gap that war had created. Not by erasing the past or pretending it had not happened, but by bearing witness to it, by acknowledging the cost, by refusing to let the silence swallow what needed to be said. This was the lesson of the snipers and their enemies. This was the truth that emerged from the valleys of Afghanistan, from the ridgelines and the crossroads and the places where death came without warning. War changes everyone it touches. It leaves marks that time cannot erase. But it also reveals something essential about the human spirit, the capacity to endure, to survive, to find meaning even in the darkest circumstances. The men who lived through those years, the hunters and the hunted alike, carried that capacity with them into the peace that followed. And in doing so, they offered a reminder to everyone who heard their stories. We are more than our worst moments. We are more than the violence we inflict or endure. We are human beings, flawed and fragile, capable of terrible things but also capable of grace. And in the end, it is grace that allows us to move forward. Grace that allows us to forgive, if not forget. Grace that allows us to look at former enemies and see, reflected back at us, the same fears and hopes that define our own lives. The distance between the sniper and his target was measured in meters. The distance between enemies could be measured in ideologies, in cultures, in all the forces that divide human beings from one another. But the distance that mattered most, the distance between hatred and understanding, between war and peace, between the past and the future, that distance could be crossed. Not easily, not quickly, not without cost, but it could be crossed. And in the crossing, something new could be found, something that honored the dead without being chained to them, something that learned from the past without being destroyed by it, something like hope. If you watch this far, it's because this story truly resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and understand who really connects with the stories on this channel. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about war and humanity in a new way, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can ensure these stories reach everyone who should hear them. Finally, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories that reveal the human side of history. Stories that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of this community that believes in the power of stories to change how we see the world.